So listen, Trump's administration just dropped a massive cache, tens of thousands of pages of what they're calling all the classified JFK assassination files. And what's interesting is that this release actually stems from that executive order Trump signed on his first day in office, aimed at uncaging all documents not just on JFK's assassination, but also on his brother, Robert Kennedy, and even MLK.
Right.
So it wasn't just a one-off move.
Right. And you have the National Archives in the mix, posting these records online in hard copies and on analog media at College Park. It's like they're making sure every avenue is open so researchers can dig in.
Definitely. Although not all of the documents are out digitally yet, some are still under digital embargo or hidden behind redactions, probably due to court seals or tax return info restrictions. Still, it's a huge step.
And there's the detail about how historians have already been expecting pretty much the same old narrative, that Lee Harvey Oswald, in his rather controversial lone wolf style, was the assassin.
Exactly. Even after this massive dump, nothing seems to shift from the original findings after the Warren Commission, which was set up by Lyndon Johnson. It's like the narrative remains stuck on Oswald acting alone, even though, conspiracy theories always lurk in the shadows.
True. But what about that one document that came from a KGB official, Nikonov? It pointed out that Oswald was a pretty lousy shot, and even mentioned his tumultuous relationship with his Soviet wife. Sounds almost trivial, yet it was used for determining if he was like a KGB asset.
Right. It's funny in a way. It's like the KGB spent time crunching thick files just to decide Oswald wasn't their puppet. Nikonov doubted anyone could control him, yet, kept a close watch while he was over in the USSR.
And that little tidbit about Oswald's marksmanship, described as pretty poor, is definitely something that spices up the narrative. Some conspiracy theorists even latch onto those details, trying to push an alternate agenda.
Sure. Some folks say if Oswald was such a bad shot, then maybe he wasn't even the right hand of a grand conspiracy. Or maybe he was set up to be a scapegoat. But the Clark-like consensus still leans toward him acting alone, which continues to make many question if anything new really changes our understanding.
Now here's one thing I've been mulling over. If all these files have mostly already been public in redacted forms before, can we say this new release genuinely gives us groundbreaking details?
That's a good point. A lot of experts like James Johnston mentioned that if there was any real bombshell hiding, the agencies wouldn't have let them go to the National Archives years ago. So it seems like these records reaffirm what we already suspect, rather than overturning decades of investigations.
Exactly. And then there's the DoD documents from 1963 that veer off into Cold War jargon, talking about Castro and subversive actions in Latin America. It feels like another piece of the puzzle that, while important for historical context, doesn't necessarily rewrite the JFK story.
Right. It's like a complimentary exhibit in a museum, fascinating and full of context, but not, the full picture that would upend what we already believe.
Yeah.
And then we've got Trump's promise of maximum transparency, which definitely sounds appealing, but also leaves some questions on the table.
Yeah, and Tulsi Gabbard, Trump's director of national intelligence, was quick to point out that this is aimed at rebuilding trust with the American people. But critics have always argued that the intelligence community tends to withhold anything that might ruffle too many feathers.
Exactly. While it's a big step toward openness, we still have a sizable chunk of the files, like 2/3 of what's promised, that remain under wraps. That makes me wonder if or when we'll see those files fully declassified. It's like trying to finish a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces.
And there's also that mad scramble in the DOJ to meet Trump's deadline, right? Attorneys across the NSD were hustling to put a second set of eyes on these documents, which just shows you how much pressure there was to deliver this data.
True. That frantic pace might also mean that the process was a bit rushed in places, which could affect how some details are presented. It leaves room for a critical appraisal of whether the document curation really served public interest or just the political agenda.
That definitely brings up a concern. I mean, while transparency is key, there's always that nagging thought. Are we just witnessing a politically charged release rather than a genuine historical unveiling?
Yes, and it's almost like the system is trying to have it both ways. On one hand, we get this surge of declassified info that, as JFK scholar Jefferson Morley noted, is an encouraging start. And on the other hand, there's still a bundle of records like those new FBI files and IRS documents that haven't made the cut. It leaves something to be desired for full clarity.
Exactly. Speaking of which, do you think these newly discovered FBI records, the 2,400 files, will eventually reveal anything that drastically changes the narrative?
Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's hard to say. Right now, the consensus seems to be that nothing surprises us. Oswald still stands as the lone assassin, according to the official narrative. But you never know. Sometimes a detail here or there can open new avenues for reinterpretation.
True, but it's also worth noting that these files have been under scrutiny for decades since the 1990s. And if something really groundbreaking were there, surely it would have emerged by now through cross-examinations and investigative research.
Absolutely. And while the media buzzes about tremendous amounts of paper and no redactions, it might be more marketing spin than a factual breakthrough.
Yeah.
Honestly, it feels more like a reaffirmation of what we already suspect.
And then you have the shadow of conspiracy theories, which always come into play with JFK. Some folks are convinced that these documents are deliberately sanitized to maintain certain official narratives.
Right, and that's where the challenge lies. It's a double-edged sword. On one side, the release is a nod to transparency, but on the other, the continuing redactions and selective releases feed into those conspiracies. It's like the truth is just playing hide and seek with us.
Exactly. And while most of academia leans toward the historical consensus, Oswald as a lone actor, there's still a persistent public doubt that fuels these theories every time the government opens up another document vault.
True. Now, I have to say, it's interesting how these documents also include stuff about FBI and CIA operations during the Cold War, like how covert actions in Latin America were managed. It does add layers, in a way, to the bigger picture of U.S. intelligence operations during that era.
Definitely. And sort of underscores the fact that the JFK assassination wasn't an isolated event. It's interwoven with the broader tapestry of Cold War geopolitics.
Right? It's like peeling an onion. Every release document gives us another faint glimpse of how the intelligence agencies have been orchestrating, significant events throughout history. But at the same time, we're still left sorting through a lot of bureaucratic red tape.
And that, I guess, is the ultimate irony. While the promise of maximum transparency is great on paper, the reality is nuanced, with vital parts remaining classified to protect sensitive sources and methods.
Exactly. So while we celebrate this step forward, a third of all JFK files now publicly accessible, it simultaneously reminds us that the full story is still somewhat out of reach.
Yeah.
In a way, it's like we've been given a puzzle where a good chunk of the pieces are still missing.
Well put. And it also serves as a reminder that history is never fully complete until every piece can be examined in full, without fear of compromising national security.
Absolutely. And as researchers, journalists, and historians keep digging, I'm sure more detailed debates will continue about what these records really tell us about that fateful day in 1963. This conversation is sure to keep evolving as more pieces come to light.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this release so compelling. Beyond the political noise, it's an invitation to re-examine one of the most debated events in modern history.
Yeah, it's a fascinating mix of political theater, historical inquiry, and the enduring mystery of JFK's assassination. And who knows, maybe in a few years we'll finally see the complete picture.
One can only hope. For now, we'll be watching closely as historians, investigators, and the public continue to pore over every page in the hunt for the next big piece of the puzzle.
Indeed. It's been an epic ride delving into these newly released files, and this dialogue is far from over. Stay curious, and let's see what unfolds next in this decades-long saga.
Absolutely. Thanks for this great chat. It's been fast-paced and thought-provoking as always.